alphabet spaghetti. So it is the DSWG EOMP session. We need to disentangle all of that a bit first, I think. So the DSWG, as quite a few of you will know, but others may not, is the documentation standards working group. It is one of the official working groups of CIDOC. It is a venerable working group, I suspect. It's one of the oldest. Many of the outcomes of CIDOC were seeded in the DSWG, including the CRM, which then broke out to being another project. And some of the other publications that CIDOC has been responsible for also started with the Documentation Standards Working Group. Standards being an essential component of documentation. I think it's fair to say that having a uniform way of recording information has proven over time to be very useful in documenting and then retrieving that information and working with it. I'm sure I don't need to sell standards to anybody who's come to a CIDOC conference. So that's the DSWG. What is the EOMP then? Well, the EOMP is the Encyclopaedia of Museum Practice. And the encyclopedia came out of discussions that we had, and I was trying to remember where we first had it. I've got a feeling that the first discussions about having a place where we could discuss the different ways that museums operated across the world may even happened as long ago as Sibiu, but I don't think that was where we had the first encyclopedia meeting. I can't actually remember where that was.
No, not encyclopedia meeting, but I think that in Helsinki you were discussing the Wiki platforms with Mika Nyman.
Yes.
And
yeah, so I think first thing that we did was to decide that there was a calling for for some sort of resource that helped people to understand what certain museum practices were and what the understanding of those practices was internationally. And so we had some conversations about what that might look like. And then I went and did some digging about for a platform to put that on. And the platform that I settled on is called Wikitiki. And it's an extension of MediaWiki, which of course is the platform that Wikipedia is on. And it grew out of Wikimedia as an experiment in multilingual wiki creating. So the reason that Wikitiki seemed like an appropriate platform to choose was that it has very advanced multilinguality as part of its design concept. And in early meetings, we had expressions of interest from people speaking 40 different languages. Some of those meetings were quite large and there was a lot of enthusiasm, and we wanted to be able to accommodate all of those languages in a way that fully integrated and were able to be, we had quite a lot of discussions as to whether pages should be translations of each other, or whether they should be the practice of that linguistic area. And this is quite an interesting philosophical debate to have about a multilingual site. And what we decided was that each page would try to stay as parallel as possible, and each being a translation of each other. And trying to be a translation of each other. And that each page would have the differences between different countries of it embedded in it. So you'd have a page that looked something like, in this country, people do it like this. In that country, people do it like that. And it would say the same thing in every language. I'm sure you're already anticipating what some of the difficulties with that were going to be. And there was a general consensus that we wanted the scope of the encyclopedia to be genuinely encyclopedic, for it to be a genuine encyclopedia of museum practice, of everything that museums did. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to anybody here to learn that those two ambitions proved to be very ambitious. So I think that practice over the years since the platform was first initiated, which was, I think I first set the platform up about 4 years ago, possibly 5 years ago. And after an initial flush of enthusiasm, we got very few contributions. And I think there were a number of reasons for that. I think firstly, because the platform is actually quite difficult to use. Its multilingual features do not allow it to be a very simple platform to just add something into. It's not like some other platforms that you may be familiar with. It does have a relatively straightforward syntax, but just creating and editing a page is actually not as straightforward as some other platforms. And the multilinguality itself, I think, was quite challenging. I don't think we'd ever really, I think anybody coming to the site would not be able to really quickly, easily understand what it is they should be adding, what they should be writing, and how that was then going to be processed in terms of other languages. And then the third thing that proved to be very challenging is just the sheer range of subject matter. What museums by their very nature are interested in everything that humans do. And they use an extraordinarily wide number of practices in order to achieve those ends. And so an encyclopedia of all museum practice in the end, I think, proved to be a noble ambition, but perhaps a slightly impractical one at this point. So I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been a lot of activity on the encyclopedia in recent times. My own personal life has taken me away from, as I acquired a daughter a few years ago, as one does, and she's rather taken up all the time that I used to have to give to sort of extracurricular activities. So I've not been as active with the encyclopedia. I've tried to keep on top of maintaining the site to make sure that it still functioned, and that I've done a few upgrades to make sure that the platform has remained fresh. But in terms of new content, the vast majority of the content has actually been added by Rupert Shepherd, who some of you will have met from the earlier EODEM sessions. And he has concentrated on quite a narrow part of the encyclopedia, and I think has laid the way for the future of it. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment then and just give an opportunity for anybody to ask questions if they'd like to. Has anyone got any questions up to this point or any comments? Okay, so I'm now going to spend just a few minutes talking about some sort of redirecting of the encyclopedia that's going to rein in some of its ambition and possibly make it a slightly more achievable, give it some slightly more achievable goals. So the first thing is the platform. So I think a decision is needed on whether or not we're going to stick with this platform. My initial thought was that it would be best to move it to another platform, but that in itself is not an insignificant task. And my feeling is, having done another update recently, there have been some improvements to it as a platform, and actually that may not be necessary, but I'm very open to comments on that subject if people have a thought about how we can maintain some degree of multilinguality, but in perhaps another platform, or whether we want to. I'll do a demonstration in a moment so you can see just how multilingual this is. So the next thing is that I think that we need to rein in the degree of multilinguality that we aim for. We enabled as I say, the 40 languages that people showed an interest in. I think perhaps it might have been better to wait until some content was created in particular languages before we enabled them. That's entirely possible to do that. So the other thing that I think that we should do is restrict the number of languages that we're supporting down to those that actually have content. And then the last thing that I suggest, which is perhaps the most radical, is to narrow the focus of the encyclopedia down to being an encyclopedia of museum standards. That seems to me to be in a better fit for the documentation standards working group. It also, I think, would be a very useful resource, because there are a lot of standards in the world, an ever-growing number, particularly as digital starts to needs new standards for us to create data that is digital ready, if that hasn't already happened. So that's my proposal. I've got a question here from Joe. Hi, Joe. It isn't, but it could be, and that's one of the things that this platform would enable. It would be entirely because its base code is quite closely aligned with Wikimedia code. That does mean that aligning it with Wikidata should be possible, and that was one of our early ambitions, actually. But I think, again, by narrowing the focus of the encyclopedia, that will be easier to do, because we can use existing Wikidata data about standards to model what we need to generate about each standard, and I think that alignment would be very useful. So I'm just going to do a quick demo. Is there anyone got any other questions at this point, or any other comments? We haven't looked at pulling anything back from Wikidata. That is something we certainly could look at. It's always a shame to create anything twice. So that's certainly something that I want to look at. So if I'm going to set myself a number of tests for a decision about whether we stick with this platform or not. There is an import function in TikiWiki that does allow you to import pages from Wikimedia. So I'm going to look a bit closer and see whether there is an import function from Wikidata.
I was just wondering if any person from this group who is here now, well, we are 12, but anyway, is familiar with this kind of environments in general. Is Jonathan the only one who is familiar with Wikitiki? Are there people around who have been, for example, writing Wikimedia entries or familiar with Wikidata? Okay.
I'm
David.
also familiar with Wiki in museum practice, because I prepared some small wiki. It was in a portable wiki format to be distributed on the stick, and it described museum terms.
Okay, great. That sounds.
Of course, in Czech, it was a translation of international sources into Czech for Czech museum people.
Yeah. Well, one of the options in terms of changing platform would be to simply move to MediaWiki. When Wikitiki first started up, MediaWiki, the Wikipedia, which is obviously the main thing that people will be familiar with, that's based on MediaWiki, was essentially a series of completely different sites in different languages. So Wikipedia had a Czech site, it had an English-speaking site, it had a Russian-speaking site, and so on. And those were pretty much independent instantiations. Whereas that's simply not the case anymore. That Wikimedia has moved a long way towards integrating those pages in different languages that are about the same subjects. So it may be that actually the need for the multilinguality of Wikitiki is not as needed as it was. So just to show you some of the function that you can get out of one of the things that Wikitiki does that at the time that I chose it, no other platform did, was allow you to translate all of the labels. And actually to do some really quite complicated assignment of terms in multiple languages, so that if the Tiki came across that term in another page in another language, then it translated it on the fly. So it did some quite complicated things. We haven't, I can't really demonstrate the full depth of it, but to show you the degree, well, so these are all the languages that we have in here, quite a lot of them, as you can see. But if we were to see, I'm not quite sure which languages it has been translated into, but you can see that if you change the language, quite a lot changes, including the loss of the logo. But all of quite a lot of the actual architecture of the page gets translated as well, not just the content. And this is the difference between the multilinguality of Wikitiki and the multilinguality of some other CMSs, some other content management sites, whereby the content gets translated, but all the labels that go around it stay in the sort of the home language, whatever that was. And that seemed quite attractive. To be able to translate absolutely every word on the page, although actually doing that translation is quite hard work, it has to be said, and somebody actually has to do it. So some of it comes happens automatically, and it is possible to use other people's translations of some of the modules that the wiki is made up of. But again, that doesn't just happen of itself. It needs somebody to manage it. And that has to happen for every one of the 40-odd languages. So and the other thing that the system allows you to do is to sort of translate pages. So you can see what translations there are here, and you can flip between them. So we have a Spanish version, we have a Portuguese version, we have a Romanian version, and we have a Finnish version. But and when you sort of go into translate mode, then you kind of get this split screen business whereby you can, oh no, that's wrong. That's what happens when you move to Finnish.
Well, it had automatically translated only the title, and that was not a good translation.
No, okay.
So, I don't approve. Let's take Finnish out until I get somebody to do it for real.
Yeah. So Joe's asking whether or not it mightn't be a better idea to just move all of this activity into MediaWiki and to simply have just use MediaWiki. And I believe it's possible to have like subdivisions, sort of little areas of MediaWiki that are slightly sort of editorially controlled. I can see the advantage of that, and I'm a great advocate of data living in the biggest container that it possibly can, where it's going to get the most visits and the most use. The only advantage of having it as a site that's hosted as part of the DSWG, the documentation, is that does give it a certain degree of authority and allow us to interact with it from the CIDOC website in a slightly more controlled way. But I would be open to arguments around that. I think it might be worth putting a couple of entries into Wikipedia and then seeing what we can do with them. I'm a bit, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been able to do that really quickly, but I haven't actually interacted with Wikipedia in that way for some time. But I suspect that, like a lot of other platforms, it's fast moving, and what we can do with it is probably a lot greater than now than it was back then, and that might be the best thing to do. So currently people come to the site from Google. Yes, there are links to it on the CIDOC website, but because it never really reached a point where I was proud of it, we didn't really go down the whole SEO helping people to find it really. I really did see it as pre-beta almost, and wasn't that keen to start shouting about it until there was a better experience when people arrived here. So I think that reworking it so that the areas where there is content were much more prominent would make it much easier to promote the site. So the areas where there are where the actual standards area of the site, which the credit for this must go almost entirely to Rupert Shepherd, has got quite a comprehensive list of mostly Anglophone standards. And this is not an unuseful, I have been told that this is not an unuseful resource, that this is actually, people do use this as a resource. And it seems to me that working up this, sort of promoting this part of the existing content to becoming the sort of spine of a new encyclopedia of museum standards sounds sounds like a good way forward to making it possible to promote it in a more focused way. So I did do some documentation around the actual standard itself, and so we've got a how-to page. There's quite a lot in there. That's not displaying very well. So there's a sort of a and we did a few test pages and that kind of thing, but I agree that I definitely think that we could do some much stronger documentation and some much stronger support for users if they were to if we were to narrow that focus. Okay, so I've put forward a sort of it feels like a sort of proposal there. There's a three-pronged proposal. Firstly, that we explore another platform. Secondly, that we narrow the number of languages that we offer out of the box to, I think, the three core languages of ICOM and CIDOC, which are English, French, and Spanish, and also to those languages for which we have content. And that will considerably reduce the managerial load in terms of managing lots of languages that we don't have credit for, but then also to repurpose the content that we have to becoming and renaming the encyclopedia to being the encyclopedia of museum standards rather than the whole of museum practice. So I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts on those notions and any other thoughts they've got around the promotion of standards and the promotion of international standards in particular. That is, by which I mean both standards that are applicable across the world, but also standards that a particular country may have, or speaking region may have promoted that other regions will be interested to interact with. So I mean international in both those senses. What do people think?
Well, I think if we're going to look at the platform, you'd have to ask what benefit could we expect to get from changing to a different platform, apart of course from the work of migrating, which would clearly be there. It seems to me, looking at the outline that we've got here, we've got lots of headings and very little content. And so, you know, the job of filling those headings in with something useful is very clearly laid out already in the platform we've got. So unless you feel that the wiki is so uniquely difficult to actually get in and edit with, I really would question whether we'll make progress simply by shifting to some other platform, unless there are specific benefits that someone can outline that this other platform might offer.
I have suggested a solution to this difficulty, and that would be simply sharing tasks, because I know that a lot of museum people, they throw their hands up as soon as you would need to start entering data into something like this and learning new things and creating passwords and usernames. And that's why I said that what has been successful in different co-creation projects in Finland is that there is a core group of people who take care of the data entry, But then there are other groups of people who do, for example, research or check dates or names or other authorities, go through references to create the content. So
yes.
I agree that we might be able to find an easier platform, but again, most of us probably know what kind of mess it is to move from one place to another and setting it up. So we will waste a lot of time and energy there.
Yeah. I do think there's some advantages to sticking with the multilingual first platform, in that it might in future grow. You know, if our ambition remains international, which it does, then the number of languages managed might grow to a point where that became a selling feature. And also there is, as Richard says, there is the effort of migrating. I think that a key thing for me would be to explore the relationship that we can establish between the Tiki and Wikipedia and MediaWiki. The fact that they seeded from the same code, I think, speaks to it being quite likely that we can establish quite strong links between the two. And if that's the case, then I think I'd feel more confident about staying in this platform. I do think it's possible with a narrower subject, a narrower focus, to provide stronger support for users, and definitely of the kind that you're describing, Maya, there, of perhaps developing more than one community. You know, a small community of actual page creators and editors, and a wider community that might use, for instance, so the system comes with you know, really it comes with a lot of tools, including a sort of a chat function, but it's a bit more than a chat function. I can't remember quite what the term is I'm looking for, but so it's possible also to have sort of it comes with a blogging area as well, and a sort of conversational area. So it might be possible for people to contribute in a more narrative way, rather than having to create, you know, sort of to suggest ideas that we can then go and follow up. Joe's pinged a few more good questions to me. So documentation standards or standards as a whole. I think museum standards. I think not just documentation standards, but museum standards generally. I know that still keeps the scope quite wide, but I do think that would be a service that we could provide, that, you know, managing standards that were not about documentation shouldn't be that different from managing standards that are not about documentation. And I think once we've put the platform together to be able to do that, then having them all together might prove to be quite useful, particularly as one of the sort of features of the digital age is that the distance between documentation and what you do is less now than it ever has been. I mean, I think those of us involved with documentation would always argue that documentation should be close to all of the action. But in fact, now to get any reuse out of almost any action or any resource that's created, one needs to document it in a way that allows that gives it some reuse and some discoverability. So in fact, I don't think there are many standards now that wouldn't have some kind of output that could be described as documentation, that they might actually, you know, be ascribing an identifier to a certain kind of action or activity. So I think that's I think definitely that's the one breadth that I think I would suggest we held on to. The WYSIWYG editing, this system has WYSIWYG editing actually. I didn't find it very comfortable to use. I actually found it easier to do it in markup, but then that's just me, I'm used to markup. But the WYSIWYG editing is pretty good actually in Wikitiki, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if there wasn't some symbiosis between the WYSIWYG in the two systems. It may be that they've borrowed a bit of code from each other. So yes, again, this templating is definitely possible. That's something we could set up. The system has good templating. As far as external authentication is concerned, so users don't have to create new accounts, that I don't know, but you'd have to hope so. but I don't know what other other external systems we would perhaps, you know, authenticate from. Again, I suppose Wikipedia possibly. So what extra would we be adding to the standards? I think that there is some narrative. I think standards always require a bit of narrative around them. I always think that there's nothing less. It's very hard to use a standard without a bit of context and a bit of chat. The number of standards that you can get off the shelf and just use, I think, is very few. And that might be a comment about the way the standards are written, or it might just be a fact of life that actually the real world is more complicated often. So I think that I think that having the standards in a place where narrative, supporting narrative and dialogue is possible, it does have something to sell for it, particularly in the chat function.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was wondering, are you still sharing just the front screen? I was wondering if you would put it back to the list which Rupert had created, which was the entries to be filled, so to say. And when I was thinking about use for this encyclopedia is that now we use the word standard very freely, but I think we use the standard meaning like the recommendations and common practices and so on. It's not the nailed down ISO standard. So actually that is very close to museum practice then, but might give us a little bit better focus on what we enter there. And as museum professionals, we often get questions from people, for example, the computer systems, which is the better one, and what should I choose, and so on. So we could also refer to this kind of recommendations or standards which help people to find answers to these questions.
Yeah, I mean, those were exactly the kinds of things that led us to extending the encyclopedia to the whole of museum practice. I seem to remember that acquisition procedures were a topic of great interest in two of the sessions that we ran at other events, and there was a real enthusiasm for having pages that described the differences between acquisitions and accessioning and those kind of things. And that was one of the things that people were getting quite excited about, was that there will be a place where they can go and see what, you know, if you were doing a loan to a country that you hadn't had a lot of contact with before, you could go and see what their practice was in that particular area. And I think that if such a resource would be incredibly useful, but I'm not sure that we're the people to make that, because I just, you know, as Nick Crofts is very fond of saying, you know, we are all volunteers here. There is nobody getting paid to do any of this. It's all outside of our paid work, and that, you know, every letter that gets written is a plus. There's no fail, but that does mean that we do need to sort of focus on the things that are achievable rather than sort of thinking too big.
Well, yes, I was looking at the collections management section and thinking, yes, that looks really useful, until I found there was no content. But now I've found the accessioning page, and suddenly there's a thing about accessioning in Brazil.
Yeah.
You know, and that's exactly the sort of thing you were describing. And suddenly it has some immediacy. But, you know, arguably you could say, go to Collections Trust and say, well, we've got this section which is about collections management. Here's a great opportunity for you to seed that with some suitable text taken from the Spectrum framework, which would act as PR for Spectrum, but also is very much you putting your message out to a broader audience, and just delegate that bit of the content, at least the initial population of it, to a body that actually has a vested interest in working with that. And if I may, there's another thought that's cropped up, which is about these standards. We're talking about how much descriptive text to add, but I think a really useful thing would be to provide keywords which distinguish what type of standard it is. Because if you end up with 200 standards there,
yeah,
to know which ones are controlled vocabularies, which ones are relevant in Brazil, you know, which ones relate to collections acquisition or whatever, would enable you to find the standards that you actually want to use. And that might be as valuable as the textual description.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I mean, another way of going through that is categorization, of course. So the site has very strong categorization function. So we could ascribe controlled tags to things if that would help discovery, or we could do sort of more free word texting. The search function on here is more powerful than the other two CMSs that I use most, which are DocuWiki and WordPress. It is possible to do proper Lucene searching it is possible to have a Lucene engine very easily installed with this platform. If we should ever need that degree of data, if we ever have that much text to search across, that could obviously be quite powerful. But I mean, this is quite interesting. So supposing we were interested in, I don't know, let's search for something and see what comes up. Let's say we're interested in coins. I don't know. Let's see if anything comes up. Coins. No coins. Let's try
database.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something. Database search. Collections management system. So we do have something about. So we've got. So here's another list we've got. So here's that list that you were describing, Maya. So we also have this, which again is Rupert's work. We have a repository, and I suppose the question would be: would this be inside? Is this inside scope of standards or not? I mean, this is a very useful resource, no doubt. But I suppose that the connection between the databases and the standards is are the databases standard compliant? I suppose is the connection.
Yeah, I think this list was created in our workshop 2017 we had in Tbilisi.
Yeah.
And this is when we started the creation of EODEM. But in addition to that, we were asking people to list as many collections management systems they were aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then Rupert,
I mean, there's no doubt that is a very useful resource, and it would be a shame to see it go. But I guess that if we're going to narrow our scope a bit, there has to be some things that are inside and some things that are outside of scope. Otherwise, we lose that sort of focus and possible sharing of energy. I'm going to ask Joe a question back. I don't know if you're actually able to speak to us, Joe. Whether you've got a mic on your setup.
I do. I have a crying baby here, though.
Oh, that's lovely. It's okay. Babies are good. So could you just say a bit about where you're going with the notion of the difference between a data repository and a wiki?
Well, it kind of simplifies. It simplifies what people need to put in. I mean, the problems with wiki in general is that you can do anything you want with them. So unless you kind of very much limit what you're expecting from people don't know what you need. They don't know what information is important. Do you need a link? Do you need a comment? Do you need a title? Do you need categories? And it may well be that if what you want, if you limited it to standards, is a link to the standard, a descriptive summary of the standard with categories and potentially a file, then a data repository software may do that very nicely for you and be easier to manage. That was kind of my thought. The other thing is that if you have effectively lists of things, which again have a comment, a title, and a link to something else, there may also be more sort of flexible ways or lower sort of administrative headache ways of doing that. So it's kind of simplifying down how you expect people to use it, and then deciding, well, do you actually need a wiki to achieve this? Are you actually needing a wiki platform, or is a simpler solution or more targeted solution more appropriate? And it comes down to how much time you've got to do stuff. So
that's really useful, Joe. Thank you. So actually, so a place where we could get the do both of those things is, again, that this platform is built on, I mean, it has an underlying database, as a lot of CMSs do, but on top of that, it also has its own, I'm trying to think what it calls them now. I don't think it calls them tables, but it basically is it is possible to create tables of data entry that then get turned into pages and can be switched back and edited again in a tabulated form. And it feels to me
like
that would certainly make the data entry simpler, because, as you say, Joe, it's much simpler to fill in a form with a series of headings. If that then got turned into a page, that doesn't take away the ability that the wiki might give us, is to then have a conversation and to put something, additional comments around that standard. So we'd get the best of both worlds. I can't remember what they actually call them in here, but it is, I mean, a lot of what we're seeing here
in MediaWiki, it's the structure they use is semantic templates, semantic forms.
Yeah.
And there's I mean, if they share code, it's probably very similar. Sure. But it also means that if you then decide that you want to change that template across all of the standards that have been added in there, you could then run queries to find out, okay, I've changed the template, added 3 extra fields. Please give me a list of all of the standards that haven't had these fields filled in yet. And these sorts of things would help you to simplify or manage the administration of the process.
That is certainly the advantage of structured data, is that ability to manage it in that way. And that's why I think museums have gravitated towards databases as a way of recording their collections, is because
I think do you know the Cameo database from MFA Boston?
I don't know.
It's a database they've done on materials, so pigments, oils, these sorts of things. Okay. And it's entirely built in MediaWiki. And there's a lot of nice data in there, but to be honest, I haven't looked at it in the last year or so. They may have changed things, but they historically didn't use templates.
Yeah.
So it meant the management and control over this huge wealth of data they had was more complex.
Yeah.
So it's not that it makes it easier for people to add stuff in. It also makes it easier for you to run it if you are the one volunteering for that task.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's good thinking. I really do. I think that's attractive, both from what we could present with it and also what we could do with it. Because also, if it's structured in that way, then interacting with other structured data becomes a lot simpler. So
you could use the CIDOC CRM to describe it.
Well, that was always yes, we could. We'd have to think about what benefit we'd get from that. I'm not sure whether we're going to achieve the degree of complexity that the CRM can help with.
You don't have to use it all.
Okay, so that seems to point to a very particular arena of investigation that I shall engage with. Does anyone else have any kind of comments about what kind of things they would be pleased to find in here? And also to say, supposing we have let's leave it with that first question first before I go on to my second thought. So does anyone have anything that they would be really pleased to find in here? Or the kind of things that they would be really pleased to find altogether?
Can I just add that if you're going to change it to being museum standards as a top level title, it would be very helpful in the second level title or the description to say that you encompass best practice.
Yeah.
So that you're actually looking for descriptions of best practice. Because I think someone said before, the notion of if it's not an ISO standard, we're not interested. Most things we do are not ISO standards. But if there's agreed best practice, And that comes down to whether you want to include the notions of procedural documents. You know, if you're packing a display case, you do this, 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 and this. It's not a standard, but this is the recommended way. You know, so it's do you want to move towards the notion of how-tos?
Yeah.
In
so
addition,
that's definitely, that was a large part of our early discussions, and it's why it ended up being an encyclopedia of museum practice. Is that's exactly the sort of thing people were very keen to find here, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for uploading, you know, museums practice, so to speak. So, you know, I mean, I'm sure, you know, we all work in, and for those of us who work in an organization, we've all probably got an enormous body of both policies and procedures that guide what we do, and they grow exponentially, these things. And whenever I'm starting a new one, I usually start by doing a shout out to various communities saying, anyone got one I can start with? And if this could be the place that people went to find one to start with, I think that would be a very useful function. And I think that comes back to whether or not these things all need a page, or whether it can be a document repository. So that comes back to what you were saying about data, Joe. And I think that actually we should be able to have pages about things that we haven't got uploaded that are actually a link to an external resource, because we don't want to import things that are available elsewhere already. That'll just get out of sync with most up-to-date versions.
Jonathan, have you used Zenodo?
Zenodo, no.
It's an open data repository connected with CERN. Basically, because CERN produces so much data, they just really don't care what other data people put in there, because volume-wise, it's just nothing. So you can use that as a data repository for data sets and things that are produced in relation to research work. I haven't used it much. I've just been playing with it recently because they seem to be exploring the notion of using IIIF. So if you upload an image, they do kind of have a IIIF endpoint. So you kind of get a server for free, but it's rate limited. But this is why I was kind of exploring the notion of data repository versus wiki, because effectively that is a free service. And if therefore you created a space within Zenodo for museum standards, and then you sort of documented how best to add a museum standard into that open repository, then potentially you could create a place to store it all. And then there might be, say, simply some nice lists that could be organized somewhere that are managed to point people to them. Because you can have categorization, you can have comments and descriptions. So that's kind of what I was exploring, is that if you're struggling with, this is a lot of work to manage, and we get very valuable content, but it's a lot of work to manage and people find it difficult to get involved. If effectively there's somewhere else that just looks after them and all you have to manage is a list of signposts, that may make it a lot more manageable.
And that, I mean, but that would point, the thinking of that sort of points us back to MediaWiki again, because that you could do that in
but you would still have to host and manage MediaWiki. This is what I'm thinking about, is that if you're struggling for time, if the main permanent repository is looked after by someone else, and worst case scenario, someone could just do a search of some data repository and they could find the stuff they're looking for, then you've kind of ticked that minimal box. That's what I was sort of thinking of, is that if that minimal box is not enough, then that's not an option. That's you know, that's fine. But,
well, it might be worth doing a test on that to see whether it is enough. But if we're going to put it into an external repository, then in a way, perhaps Wikipedia goes back to that again. That actually, although that is still a CMS, it is a CMS that has a data structure behind it, or increasingly has a
it has issues to do with novelty. You know, if someone decides that what you've put in isn't novel enough or doesn't meet certain standards, then your pages can be deleted again. I mean, this is the difficulty of Wikipedia as a whole. It's quite hard for you to rely on it as a repository to maintain long term. That's the main reason why you'd want to host your own, is you can decide what's included and what isn't. But it's just, I mean, yeah, you've got a lot more flexible practice if you host your own service, but the difficulty is managing the time. Then there are alternatives.
Yeah.
It seems to me that our main problem is not so much the effort involved in managing this resource as the challenge of getting people to actually put anything in it. And
Well,
as
fair enough.
such, I think we should be maybe, looking at that and wondering whether there's any programmatic way in which we could actually let people produce larger scale data that could actually be imported into the wiki rather than everything having to be done by hand, sort of interactively.
Does this wiki have a bot, Jonathan? Has it got an API and stuff?
It certainly does have an API that, again, it's something that you can enable with it.
Okay.
But that speaks to the underlying MySQL database, and that's not something I've not really explored very much.
Because theoretically, along Richard's line, you could come up with a very simplified Excel spreadsheet and say, if you describe which matches, coincidentally, the template that you would create, people could have a little spreadsheet that then uploaded all the stuff that they've listed, as Richard's just said. And you could manage it that way if that would make it easier for people to import stuff.
There is the documentation for Tiki is so vast that the best way to search it is not in its own search function, but actually through Google. It is. So you can import and export data as PHP MyAdmin, profiles, wiki. There's an XML import export function.
Well, there you go.
Always good. And there seems to be some sort of batch load as well. Let's have a look. Oh, this is yeah. So it's been there a long time. A list of pages or a structure and Excel. Okay, so yeah, you can basically import. You can import a page in XML.
So who's going to write the XML?
Richard. Well, that may not be necessary because I actually looks as though there's a little tool here that will do it for you. That if you write an export, then you've basically written an import. So I think it probably goes back to the forms and to the templates again. If you write a template, put some data in it, export it, you've probably created the data structure to put it back in again as well. That's definitely worth looking at, because again, that would be a really easy way of people contributing, would be to just say, we could open up we could either open, I mean, the wiki itself has a place where people can upload documents, so we could just say, stick a, just upload a spreadsheet here, or we could have another repository somewhere. I mean, I think DSWG has a Google Drive somewhere, I expect.
Can I ask a slightly sort of off-topic question?
Yeah.
Have you ever approached any funding agencies to say that you would like to be the repository of outputs of research projects?
No.
So effectively, because
we had
a small person.
We had the beginnings of a conversation with ICON when they got in touch with CIDOC and said, "Where is your repository of all standards?" Because they kind of expected that we would have one, and I got a message back to them. It was quite, you know what it's like communicating with ICON. I got a message back to them through Nick, I think it was, to say we did actually have a place where we could do that, but we don't have the resources. Please, could ICON come up with either a member of staff in Paris or a pot of money that would allow us to hire someone for 6 months or 3 months just to get it going? And answer came there, none. But that probably wasn't the right place to ask. It may be that one of the national, somebody like Collections Trust or one of the nationals might be a better place to start. But ideally, what we want to do is to get it as international as possible, as quickly as possible. I mean, it would be really great if there were standards in there from Russia, China, Japan, America from the get-go, because otherwise, people coming to it looks very Euro, if not UK centric. Otherwise,
yeah. Well, could I suggest as a way forward that if we start by taking a couple of well-known standards and actually producing what we think of as concise but model entries for them,
yeah,
and using that as the thinking time to decide what we need our template to have in it,
yeah,
export those, explore the template export import sort of capabilities that shows to be possible, think about practicalities as to what we could actually offer to the community for a format they could fill in. Ideally, as Joe said, if that could just be an empty spreadsheet template for them to put some entries in, then we might actually lower the bar to the point where more of the CIDOC community would actually pitch in and be actively involved in helping. Because I think that, that's been the problem. It's one I'm very familiar with, having been chair before you of this working group, that you can get enthusiasm at the point of a CIDOC conference, and you get people in the room and you get them quite excited even, but then they go away and they go on with their lives and forget this wonderful experience and the promises they made.
And talking of going away, I've been told by our event moderator that we've run out of time. So I thought we might struggle to fill our slot, but we've actually come to the end of time. I was expecting us to have another quarter of an hour, but it seems that we have run out of time. It's probably from my miscalculation.
Yeah, we're sorry, but the next session is starting at 5:15, unfortunately. So we really have to cut this one.
No worries.
Sorry
Carol,
about that.
Very much. Thank you very much for supporting us through this.
You're welcome.
I will write these up.
You're most welcome.
Do I get a participant list, Carol?
Sure, we can send that to you.
Great. I will be in touch with all of you to write up some of our decisions and some of our explorations, and perhaps we can do it together.
Right. Great.
Great. Thank you all very much.